In the previous lecture, we were at the summit of Mount Moriah in Genesis 22, and we were watching Abraham discover that faith is not just an unthinking blind leap, but for him, in that case, a calculated logical trust in the character and faithfulness of God. Today, as we look at Genesis chapters 22 through 26, we have an interesting transitional period in the stories of the patriarchs. On one side of this section, God's promised Abraham and his offspring the entire land of Canaan, but on the other side, the patriarchs are getting older, wives are dying, famine is striking, and fear that Abraham experiences coming to the surface again. So this creates a profound tension, the space between promise and possession. In this video, we're going to explore how Genesis navigates this gap. We're going to look at a seemingly mundane real estate transaction in Genesis 23 that actually functions as Israel's first legal down payment on the promised land. And then we'll examine the brief spotlight on Isaac, a patriarch whose life serves as an exact mirroring echo of his father Abraham, even though we don't know a lot of other things about him. Before we dive into the events of Genesis 23, I want to ask a hermeneutical question that every student of biblical literature eventually confronts. What do we do when we hit odd or weird or seemingly mundane passages in Scripture? Think about Genesis 23. The entire long chapter is dedicated to negotiations, legal technicalities, silver weights, and real estate land deeds over a cave. So to a modern reader, scanning through Genesis looking for big dramatic moments like the voice of God calling or miraculous birth, Genesis 23 feels weird and maybe like dry filler or like administrative red tape. But as we've discussed throughout this course, biblical narrative is constructed for a reason. There's a design behind it. Decades of history are skipped in a single sentence gap. So when the author slows the pace down and spends an entire chapter detailing this kind of weird, tedious land transaction, this is not just filler. It's a deliberate, neon bright marker sign signaling that something of crucial theological importance is taking place right beneath the surface. And this is important to remember. When we read the Old Testament, if we see something and we think, that's weird, it probably means it's important, and we need to dig a little bit deeper to see what's going on there. Conflict here. Genesis 23 sets up a stark, painful clash between the divine word, but then the human reality that's on the ground. On the one hand, sworn a covenant promising Abraham and his descendants will inherit the whole land of Canaan, the promised land. But on the other hand, Sarah, Abraham's faithful wife of decades and the mother of the promise, she dies. And when Abraham goes to mourn her, he realizes a heartbreaking fact. Even though he's lived in Canaan for many years under a divine promise, he actually owns 0 square feet of territory here. He doesn't even have a patch of dirt to bury his wife. So in Genesis 23:4, Abraham introduces himself to the locals with a crucial legal phrase, "I am a sojourner and a foreigner among you." So this defines the core sojourner identity of the patriarchs. As aliens without citizenship, Abraham couldn't own a piece of land and keep it in Canaan. He doesn't have it. It wasn't passed down to him from his father. So if he leases property or accepts a land gift from the local people, the title would legally go back to those people upon his death. Notice also his choice of location. By refusing to take Sarah's body back to his ancestral homeland in or Haran, Abram's actually making an act of faith. Returning her remains to where he came from would have signaled retreat from the covenant, from God's promise, from what God had told him he would get. But burying her here in the promised land anchors his family permanently in Canaan. That brings us to the actual negotiation of Genesis 23, and it raises an interesting question. Why pay a fortune for what God has already promised that you owed? When Abraham approaches the men to buy the cave at Machpelah, Ephron uses polite, high-stakes, ancient Near Eastern bargaining language. In Genesis 23:15, Ephron says, "The land is worth 400 shekels of silver, but what is that between me and you?" It's not a big deal. He's basically saying that 400 shekels is just a mere trifle. But what he's actually doing is naming a ridiculously sky-high, exorbitant price. To put 400 shekels into perspective, an average laborer in the ancient Near East earned about 1 shekel a month during this time. So roughly 10 to 12 shekels per year. That means 400 shekels is about 35 to 40 years of wages for a common worker. Compare this to other transactions in the Bible in the ancient Near East. Centuries later, Jeremiah buys an entire field for 17 shekels in Jeremiah 32:9. King David buys the threshing floor and oxen for 50 shekels in 2 Samuel 24:24. And in the Code of Hammurabi, an adult slave is listed as costing 20 to 30 shekels. Buying a single cave and field for 400 shekels was the equivalent of paying a ridiculously high, overpriced price for commercial real estate. So why doesn't Abraham haggle? Because as an alien, a resident alien, accepting a gift or bargaining down would leave that land vulnerable to future legal claim from the man that's selling it to him. So above all, we have to see that this transaction is an act of faith. Humanly speaking, he drops a fortune on a grave in a land where he owns zero territory, and that seems reckless. But Abraham puts his silver, his money, where his faith is. By paying this full, overpriced amount in front of witnesses, he's saying, God has promised this land to me and my descendants, so this is where we will rest, waiting for the promise to be fulfilled. So Abraham weighs out those 400 shekels of silver according to the standard of the merchants publicly at the city gate in front of the elders. He buys the field, the cave, every tree within its borders, and he secures this ironclad deed that he won't lose. So the cave at Machpelah becomes the first permanent legal stake and down payment on the promised land. It functions as like this guarantee that even in death, the patriarchs are going to be anchored in this land of Canaan. In fact, this cave, Machpelah, becomes the anchor for the rest of Genesis. Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Leah are all buried there. And when we get to Joseph, dying centuries later in Egypt, his final request is, carry my bones back to this tomb. As we move into Genesis 24, 25, and 26, the narrative shifts to Abraham's son, Isaac. Now, if you compare the four primary patriarchs in Genesis, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, Isaac by far receives the least amount of narrative. Abraham gets 12 chapters about, Jacob gets 12, Joseph gets 13-ish, and Isaac gets barely 2. So why is Isaac's story so brief? Because within the literary design of Genesis, Isaac's life doesn't exist to introduce a lot of new plot twists. Isaac is basically functioning to show an echo of his father, how Abraham's mistakes are repeating over and over throughout his family. So his life is constructed almost as a mirroring template of Abraham's journey. Through Isaac, the author of Genesis shows us how covenant promises and human flaws pass directly from one generation to the next. And God is choosing to work through not only a flawed person in Abraham, but a flawed family. So let's look at this side-by-side comparison. Notice how Isaac's major life milestones directly parallel Abraham's. Provision. Abraham receives miraculous divine provision, first in the gift of Isaac and then in the ram provided in Genesis 22 to sacrifice in place of Isaac. Isaac receives miraculous provision in Genesis 24 through the providential arrival of Rebekah at the well, preserving his holy line through his new wife. Promise. Abraham receives the covenant declarations in Genesis 12 and 15, and then repeated a few more times. And in Genesis 26, 3-5, God appears directly to Isaac and reissues the exact same verbal promises, passing down land, land, nation, and blessing to Isaac in those exact words. But then the same pitfalls. When we hit this last row, this is where the mirror becomes uncomfortably sharp, maybe. Just as Abraham defaulted to fear and lied about Sarah claiming she's my sister twice in Egypt and Gerar, Isaac turns around and utters the exact same lie about Rebekah in Gerar. Now, you could look at this story and think that maybe this is even the exact same person because it says Abimelech. But during this time, Abimelech just means my father is king. And it's most likely that this was a title for rulers in this time, in this land. So although it maybe could be the exact same person, it's doubtful in this case. But what we do see is that the exact same lie is being repeated. So let's pause on Genesis 26:7 and Take in the tragedy of this moment. A famine hits in the land, just as it did in Abraham's day. Isaac settles in Gerar among the people, and right after God specifically tells him, I will be with you and bless you, panic takes over. When the local men ask about his wife, Rebecca, Isaac says, she's my sister. Why? The text tells us, because he feared to say, my wife, thinking, lest the men of this place should kill me on account of Rebecca. Think about the absurdity of this fear. God Almighty's just guaranteed to preserve Isaac's life, to build an everlasting covenant, a whole nation through him. Yet, at the first sign of pressure, Isaac adopts his father's old playbook of self-preservation through lying and deceit. Look at the bottom there. The promise is perfect. The patriarch is terrified. So as we step back and look at Genesis 22 through 26 as a whole, we have to ask a core theological question. Why does Genesis highlight Sarah's delayed burial, Abraham's landless status, and Isaac's repeated cowardice? Why does the narrative, the text here, just airbrush the heroes of the faith to make them look more impressive? Because these stories exist to strip away all human heroics. If the covenant depended on Abraham's uninterrupted courage, it would have collapsed in Egypt. If it depended on Isaac's flawless faith, it would have failed in Gerar. And if it depended on human speed or cunning, the lack of immediate land ownership would have driven them to despair. But Genesis proves that the preservation of the covenant rests 100% on the faithfulness of the promiser, not on the perfection of the patriarchs. God keeps his word through landless sojourners and fearful sons, slowly but surely anchoring his redemptive plan in history and in this land. So next time we're going to see these exact dynamics play out in the third generation as we meet Isaac's twin sons, Esau and Jacob, and trace how deeply flawed Jacob is as he is a deceiver and usurper, and then how he's transformed into someone different and given a new name, Israel.